Hello, team. Welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War news update, a Kursk special to find out what's going on in the area of Russia that the Ukrainians have invaded. I don't know whether to call it an invasion. I suppose it is. Attack, incursion, whatever. Uh, Before I go into the details of what I know, and it's very dynamic, remember that, things are going badly for the Ukrainians on the Donetsk front. So there are claims of evacuations taking place, that Kursk is being advanced to, well, the Russians are advancing, but it could be that Ukrainians are ceding territory until the major fortifications, and then that's what we're really waiting for, the Ukrainians to get there to be able to better defend against the Russian advances. Now, the question in my mind is who is going to break first. I think this is a kind of game of chicken where both sides have limited resources, and I think the Russians probably have a very fragile strength in depth. The Ukrainians do as well, but there's something tells me that the Russians are, maybe it's me just hoping, but the Russians are in probably a more fragile situation than they're let on, and that's being indicated by what's going on in Kursk and how the Russians are throwing troops into Kursk and what kind of troops they are. This is a game of chicken, and who is going to break first? Will the Russians break in the Donetsk front line area towards Pokrovsk? Will they suddenly run out of steam and have to redirect more to Kursk? Or will the Ukrainians break first and go, right, we really need to sort out Kursk and we're going to bring some troops down from our... So we really need to defend Pokrovsk. We need to bring down troops from Kursk to support that sector. That's how I see it. Let me know what you think. Right, one of the main things that's taken place over the last half a day or so is that a bridge over the same river has been struck in Kursk. This is at Glushkovo, a village there, and I'll show you this on a map. But it could also cut off supply to Tetkino. Tetkino's this border settlement that has been absolutely hammered. It was attacked by the Russian Defense Corps possibly several times over the last 6 months or so. It gets shelled a lot. So Tetkino, as you can see here from Andrew Perpetua's map, has had an airstrike on it. There was a JDAM footage of JDAM strikes on a building in Tetkino previously. I don't know what the target was, but this is supplied by road that goes over the same river at Glushkovo. And this here is Glushkovo. And this is the bridge that has now been fully destroyed. It was attacked yesterday. It had a couple of holes from HIMARS rockets or similar. Now that has collapsed. There are lots of people talking about how serious this is for the Russians, because everywhere south of this river is in a spot of bother, especially when there are now claims that the bridge has been compromised at Zvonoye here as well. That means that there is a possibility, and there's another bridge over here, I think that the Russians are concerned about, the Ukrainians are looking at. It means that this whole area is possibly under a lot of pressure for being able to be encircled, cut off, really. If the Ukrainians push further to the west, even if they bypass Koronovo, and there's talk about Koronovo being under a lot of pressure, if the Ukrainians do something like this, then the Russians are in trouble. Okay, let's look at this bridge first. So they've destroyed this bridge. It looks rather like that now. I don't think you're going to be able to use that in a hurry. Roman Alekin says the bridge has just been destroyed and Ukrainian liberation forces are implementing the plan to isolate the Glushkovo district, and that's what I was talking about. Next are reports about 700 Russian soldiers may be encircled due to the blowing up of the bridge. There are also reports in Russian media of strikes on another bridge at the village of Zvanoye in the Kursk region. There's no official comments from representatives of the Ukrainian or Russian armed forces. Russians have already, though, deployed a pontoon bridge east of the destroyed bridge near Glushkovo, but this is within artillery reach of the AFU. So that has been spotted, must be over sort of here. I think the pontoon bridge. I'd assume that the Ukrainians would be able to have a pop at that, maybe even from across the border. Let's try and get a distance on that. So if that is in that general area, yep. So easily within distance of a decent, Caesar, Archer attack. Panzerhaubitze 2000 easily should be able to hit that pontoon bridge. So we'll see whether that lasts beyond today and tomorrow. But the Russians are obviously seeing this bridge as a key logistical pinch point because they've already built that pontoon alternative. Okay, so let us go on. Sorry, I forgot where I was. Don't throw out an answer with a good time, says Michael Weiss in reaction to this. So it's all saying there are 2 more bridges over the same river. If they are all destroyed, the logistics of the Russian Federation will be in ruins. To the point where this is what some people are saying it looks like. So if those bridges go, then this whole area is suddenly cut off from logistics, which means they're cut off from Russian troops. Unless they want to swim across a river, you ain't going to get supplies, you ain't going to get reinforcements easily across into this whole area. This could be incredibly clever. You could then see this all fall to the Ukrainians, and suddenly they have a massive amount of land. They've doubled the size of what they already control. Maybe. I don't know. This is speculation. But this is certainly something to think about. If they're able to take all of this in Techinos, or you could argue that they're already shaping the area, doing shaping operations by hitting targets within this Glushkovo district, or Glushkovsky district. Let's go on to other bits of news concerning Kursk. And we'll start with Russia shifting several thousand troops from occupied Ukrainian territories to counter Ukraine's Kursk offensive. Of course, I've talked already to you a number of times that they are not going to be drawing those troops from the Donetsk front towards Pokrovsk. That is their most highly prized offensive move at the moment. The Russians are making the most gains there, putting the Ukrainians under a lot of pressure. So that would be the last place they draw troops from, but certainly from other areas on the front line. However, Russia primarily deploys untrained conscripts in Kursk. So rather than taking troops from the front lines, they are just scrabbling together as many people as they can possibly get. They're those in the detention center up in St. Petersburg, about almost 500 from there, of people, refuseniks, or people who claim to be too ill to fight or not fit enough to fight, have been detained at that center. They've been brought to Kursk, apparently. You've got conscripts in general that shouldn't really be put on the front lines, as that's not part of the remit for conscripts. It's that national service, but they appear to be using them as well in an attempt not to weaken their own front lines in the rest of Ukraine. Institute for the Study of War says troop movement is already occurring, according to Riley Bailey, a Russia analyst in the Institute for the Study of War, though not to the scale that Russia really needs to repel the attack and regain territory. So they are throwing just enough people there to stop a whole-scale disaster, but it's not enough troops, and they aren't well trained enough, if they are conscripts, to be able to do complex maneuvers to retake territory. Quote, we've seen reports of up to 11 Russian battalions redeploying from other sectors of the front to form kind of this hastily put together force grouping in Kursk Oblast, Bailey told Vox. So this is not enough for Russia to deal with the Kursk attack. And that tells you, this goes back to my previous point, that Russia, I think, are in a more fragile situation than many people realize. You would if you could, you aren't, so you can't. You remember my mantra. I talk about this all the time. If you were able to put a really good force of Russian troops to defend in Kursk and stop this attack, you would do that. The Russians would do that. It was easily, if they were able to do that, if they had strength in depth, you go, right, get the reserves over to there, bish, bash, bosh, there you go. They aren't doing that. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that that is not happening. And if it's not happening, it means it can't happen. And if it can't happen, it means the Russians are really in dire straits. Now, I'm not saying the Ukrainians aren't in dire straits. I personally think, and I have said for a long time, both sides have been degraded. Like the Russians started the war with this many troops, Ukrainians started with this many troops and equipment. The Ukrainians have been degraded loads, but the Russians as well. And I think the Russians have been degraded at a faster rate, so that actually they're starting to get closer together in terms of that numerical asymmetry. It's been going down like that. Russians degrading quicker, and we've got to this point where, yeah, okay, the Ukrainians have been degraded, and this is a properly problematic point for them. But my goodness, the Russians are not far behind them, and if they're the ones that are trying to attack and have these maximal objectives for Ukraine, they aren't going to do that. They can't do that. Russia can't take Ukrainian territory up to Dnipro River. I mean, up to Odessa, right? So Russians aren't going to be able to take all this land here, or all the land up to the Dnipro River, or really all of the Donbass, if they cannot defend Kursk adequately enough. If they can't stop their own country from being invaded adequately, how are they going to invade across the Dnipro River again and take Mykolaiv and Odessa? It's not going to happen. These people who think Russia are in some kind of commanding position here are not looking at the data closely enough. It's just, yeah. So, Russia diverts multiple units of at least 1,000 troops each to Kursk Oblast, says CNN, citing sources. While US officials have not yet determined the exact number of troops Russia has sent to combat Ukraine's incursion into Kursk Oblast, quote, multiple brigade-sized elements made up of at least 1,000 troops each appear to have shifted, CNN reported on the 15th, citing two unnamed US sources. But, again, if this is a situation, so if there's truth to this, what another Chryso Wiki thread, Russia is reportedly creating Kursk battalions of newly enlisted conscripts, many of whom are barely trained teenagers paid only 75 cents a day. And they're being sent to Kursk to fight the Ukrainian incursion. Some are being forced to sign contracts to fight on the front lines. According to the Russian news outlet Astra and Beware News, conscripts serving with the 80th Motorized Rifle Division based near Murmansk are being prepared for a business trip to the Kursk region. A similar trip is reportedly being organized in the Irkutsk region. Conscripts who were drafted in the spring of 2024 have told relatives that they will be sent to the Kursk and Belgorod regions to defend the border. They will replace conscripts who are already there. Of course, neither of those groups of conscripts should be fighting in the front lines. The conscripts are being moved urgently due to the situation in Kursk. One man from Ufa was called up for military service in early June, but is being sent to Kursk without finishing his training. Another has served only for a month, but is being sent to Belgorod soon. According to their relatives, the Russian army is stonewalling inquiries. Quote, there is no opportunity to talk to either higher command of the unit. They refuse to communicate with the parents. The phone numbers are hidden and are not given to the parents. Parents are demanding that their sons not be sent to the Kursk region where fighting is ongoing. However, although Russian law prohibits sending conscripts abroad, and this is where it's a bit of a grey area, so they're not allowed to be sent to front lines abroad, to war zones abroad, but can conscripts be used to defend their homeland? Well, it appears, I guess, they can. So when I've said they can't be used, I don't know. It's a bit of a grey area. They're not prohibited from participating in conflict within Russia's territory as at Kursk. Quote, officially, everything is legal. So I stand corrected, says Marina, the mother of one conscript. Quote, the only thing is that there is a special operation on the territory of the Russian Federation now, and maybe the guys won't be sent there. I wonder whether there was an element of Ukraine must have known that Russia would be able to send conscripts then to Kursk, but it could be that it's the Afghanistan playbook being retold here, or this is the hope of the Ukrainians that if they send conscripts, these young teenagers from families that don't want their kids to be sent to die, if those kids go back in body bags or are captured en masse, then there might be huge internal pressure put on the Kremlin and put on Putin. Could be a clever move by the Ukrainians here. So rather than look at it and saying, well, it's a bad move because Russia will be able to mobilize more troops, a wider range of troops, the types of troops that they are, untrained, young, unmotivated, with family who don't want to see them die. Could be clever. After all, the president himself, quote, always says that conscripts won't serve in the special military operations zone. That's what I was thinking of. We're praying. However, conscripts who are already serving in the Kursk region are not only engaged in fighting, but are being forced to go back into battle. After some conscripts were serving in Kursk, taken to a safe place by commanders after Ukrainian forces invaded, they are reportedly being threatened with long prison sentences if they do not sign contracts transferring them to the regular army. According to Tatiana, the mother of a conscript from Perm, they took my son's phone. He called yesterday from someone else's number. He says they are forcing him to go back to the front line or go to a punishment battalion for 7 years. Another conscript's mother, Daria from Tobolsk, says, quote, our commanders tell us this. Since they took the oath, they must defend the motherland. But what kind of warriors are they at 18 or 19 years old? They don't understand the seriousness of it. They don't realize that they have to kill there and they themselves can die. A third mother, Yulia, says that the military prosecutor's office forced them to return to their positions, but the boys flatly refused. Now they're in Kursk in a military unit. They want to send them to the third echelon of defense behind the assault groups in the Kursk region. My son called. They were told, you'll go anyway, says Elena, another of the mothers. But now we'll pay you combat pay. We'll prepare you a little and you'll go after the stormtroopers. And if you don't agree, you'll either go to court or you'll go to fight anyway. You won't get away from it. So it's this idea they're not really the third echelon of defense. She says that the army is trying to put moral pressure on them. They're trying to brainwash them and send our children to that hole. Marina says that the conscripts are being persuaded because the army needs to gather a certain number of people to bring them back. They say you'll be members of the special military operation. They are persuading you. My son told me about this half an hour ago. He says there are about 150 conscripts there now. Those who are selected who succeed are coming, namely children who were in the Kursk region. She criticizes the army for failing to give them combat training. If you wanted them to defend the borders, then why didn't you prepare them? Why did he then carry shells for 6 months and then dig trenches for 6 months? Conscripts are not entitled to anything for injuries or, God forbid, death. Contract soldiers are entitled to payments, but we don't need any money as long as the guys are safe, says Marina. She says that they are paid only 2,000 rubles a month, that's $22.70 or 75 cents a day, even if they shoot down drones on the border with machine guns. Conscripts who serve in the safe regions receive the same payments. Around 9,000 people have signed a petition asking Putin to withdraw their sons from guarding the border in Kursk. It was started by Oksana Diva, whose son is fighting in Koronovo, said to be facing a Ukrainian encirclement. Writing on change.org, she says, quote, we, the mothers of conscripts, ask you to remove the conscripts from the areas of military action. They have no experience in fighting back, no weapons. A full-scale offensive is underway on our territory today. Save the lives of soldiers who are not prepared for military action. You promised your parents that they would not participate in military action. We believe in you. We ask you to take a serious look at the current situation. We are patriots. Our sons and each of their lives will still be useful for creating a strong state, but there is enough strength from more experienced military personnel. We ask you to save the lives of our boys. We trust you. Every mother who sent her son to the border will sign my words. Hear us. See the conscripts, please. Like the other appeals to the Tsar during this war, it's unlikely that this petition will have any effect. And it's interesting that she says, but there is enough strength from more experienced military personnel. The point is that there isn't. And that's precisely why those conscripts are being sent to do that work. Now, Colby Babwa says yesterday the Department of Defense said they're still trying to understand, this is the US, Ukraine's intentions within the Kursk operation, are even after the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, spoke to Rustem Umerov, his counterpart in Ukraine. Weird statement. Now we learn that they are concerned that Ukraine has been too successful in this pushing too deep. Well, Colby Babwa says that's a weird statement. This is a problem I have foreseen, that the more successful the Ukrainians are, the more problematic it becomes, because they imagine they took all this land here, right? Then those same amount of troops, unless you've got more and more troops, which they don't, to fill this whole area and defend a longer and longer front line, then you are defending a longer front line with the same amount of troops, which means you are defending it at any point in a weaker fashion. Like I said to you, you throw a pebble into a pond, you get concentric waves. Each wave, as it goes out, gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it disappears. Because that same amount of energy is having to be dispersed on a longer and longer front line, if you like, of that wave. So the more successful the Ukrainians are, the more problematic it may become. So the question, I think that's a bona fide question for the Americans is, what are your intentions? Because you don't want to be too successful because you spread yourself too thin. According to wanted war criminal Igor Strokov, so that's Evil Gherkin, we currently detained in Russia. The Ukrainian military's offensive in Kursk region is a diversion. The main attack will target Crimea, and this goes back to what I was saying about Crimea being attacked last night, and about the Kerch Bridge and ferries across Kerch Strait being targeted. He reckons where Crimea, where all the Ukrainian reserves and F-16 fighter jets will be deployed. It's a genuine Russian concern at the moment that Crimea is actually the bigger goal here. Now, Koronovo is almost completely surrounded this morning. I mean, the point is, sorry to interrupt myself, but the point is, if Russia is unable to throw enough resources into here, if the Ukrainians really do have like secret reserves that they've been training up, and they land at Crimea, and they have a genuinely big attack onto Crimea, like, the Russians are going to be in a really difficult position because it's a game of whack-a-mole that they're losing. And those moles are popping up, and the Russians are unable to whack them down. But I don't know if the Ukrainians remotely have those kind of capacities to be able to do that. So anyway, Koronova is almost completely surrounded this morning, says PS01. Unless Russia manages to launch a new massive counterattack, I'm expecting to see columns of Russian POWs out of the city. It's very, very positive view there. Now, Koronova is over here. The claim is that it's being surrounded. Might be a larger encirclement coming from the south along here and north, much closer to Koronovo. But there's also claims, this is Tendar, the German source, saying Ukrainian forces have reached Safanovka in Kursk. What is most intriguing is not only the extent of the Ukrainian control, but also the fact that the attack there resulted from the northwest. The Ukrainian forces are obviously operating in the entire area south, west, and partially even north of it. Furthermore, Russian channels report that the town of Koronovo is starting to get encircled from north and south, as mentioned previously. So Safanovka is, so you've got Koronovo here. Safanovka is on that point there. There you go. So if the Ukrainians are there, then this entire area in the grey zone might well be under Ukrainian control. Now, this map is 11 hours old from Andrew Perpetua, time zones and whatnot. But it'll be interesting to see whether much blue gets filled in there. You can see a lot of blue was filled in along here on the last update, and also to the west. Okay, moving on. What other bits and pieces do we have? Right, no reports saying, according to the latest information, the AFU has taken control over Triukov and Kolmakov, east of Sudya. So Sudya is this town that appears to be becoming like one of the main focal points for this incursion. It's logistically important, and I think it's becoming their kind of staging ground, the Ukrainian staging ground. So this is the idea that some of the settlements to the east are under Ukrainian control. There's Dmitrikov and Kolmakov. So these two settlements now under Ukrainian control, which means Sudya really is under Ukrainian control as a whole. That's no reports reporting that from earlier this morning. So that's about 4 hours ago. Now, War Translated says, I don't know who he's talking about. Summary. So, summary of the offensive in the Glushkovko district of the Kursk region from the Russians. They say the Ukrainians are trying to gain control of or destroy the bridges over the Seyum River, as we've talked about, as well as attack Karij to cut off the supply lines of the Russian group. This would allow the Ukrainian forces to occupy a huge section of Russian territory in the area. Okay, that's what I talked about before. And then he says, he also adds that Sudya is now becoming a Ukrainian stronghold, and Ukrainians use it as a bridgehead for further incursions, which is just what I was saying then. So this is becoming the major staging point for other directions or for the whole incursion. Now, Trentulenko has a couple of threads here, and I don't know that I'm going to go into too much detail. This is a highly useful thread on the overlapping crises in the Russian railway system. Short form, Russia is in deep, deep trouble. So I referred to one of these Prune 60 threads yesterday. A broad overview of the impacts of Russian railways as a result of Ukraine's special Kursk operation. This is just a very basic guideline of the of things to look out for, expect, and think about when considering new information you may receive. Think of it as a primer for critical thinking because the impacts could go further than you expect. And reversing a lot of these things takes time too. One, Ukraine holding Russian railway assets and infrastructure denies Russia access to those resources. This may be captured or taken to Ukraine, or they may be destroyed either by Ukraine or Russia. Either way, those assets are temporary or permanently denied to Russia. That could be bridges, railway locomotives, infrastructure such as information infrastructure and computer systems. Two, Russia's defensive response to Ukraine's invasion will impact railways in a variety of ways. The part one of that is that the Russia's efforts to rapidly transport defensive assets and personnel will take up railway capacity, and they may be shipped a significant distance. These shipments are supposed to take priority over nearly everything else, but this is Russia. Rules aren't always followed. This is similar to an ambulance getting priority on a road, but this isn't a road, so there are some additional challenges. First of all, the railway is overextended. This means that currently the demand for shipping capacity is much greater than Russian Railways is able to provide. That means that not only do they have to figure out how to move everything else out of the way of the high priority load, they also have to find a locomotive to move it. That means that the locomotive that's already in use has to either finish delivering the load, or it's currently moving, or find somewhere to stash it, and then it can go and deal with the priority load. It's like doing one of those puzzles, except from the reports, it doesn't sound like their computer software is able to provide as much support as expected to help sort out the problem. So it becomes even harder. So you can imagine how much the normal freight movement will suffer as a result of Russian railways trying to figure things out, but also all the now normal chaos is still occurring, like derailments, partisan attacks, traffic jams, in the Far East, etc. And the second part of that is Russia has or likely will make efforts to deny Ukraine access to further railway infrastructure. It does not matter whether Ukraine actually would or would not use the railway infrastructure in Russia for the further movement of troops deeper into Russia. The possibility exists that they could do it using captured Russian railway equipment. They could just load up the Russian rail territory they currently hold. Russia will not want this option to be available to them, forcing them to act. Think of it like Russia painting those planes on tarmacs, thinking it will fool our satellites, probably because it fools their satellites. Russia relies heavily on the railroad for military use. They'll be thinking about this. No, in many cases, there are no alternatives to rail in Russia. Russian efforts to deny or block the railway from Ukrainian forces will expand the amount of railway infrastructure that is denied to the Russian commercial enterprises. There will be the area Ukraine holds plus the area Russian dedicates to block Ukraine. And Russian Railways has to help with any Russian fortifications required and has to figure out how to rework all their logistics and other critical obligations about these assets. Food and gas still needs to be delivered. Third issue is there may be civilian impacts. So part one of that is mass migration does cause challenges. Russian railways has had to make way for extra passenger trains to try to deal with evacuating civilians. Some of these people aren't going to be showing up to work, and they may have surprise repercussions. Second part to that, psyops or just normal reactions to events may add extra chaos. For example, railway personnel don't show up for work, a bank run, fears of a contagious disease, Russians switch sides. Fourth point is the Russian railways can't catch up. All of the shipments and commerce that is foregone as a result of the Ukraine special Kursk operation will be an overall loss to the Russian economy. This will result in less commerce and less revenue. So you can't, like, when it gets back to using the railways, you can't double what's happening because you've only got the certain amount of trains, or you can't, or only one track. You can't then suddenly double the tracks and double the trains to make up for lost time. You've lost that. That's gone. This will result in less commerce and less revenue. While some may believe that it will be insignificant overall, there will be an impact. No, I would argue it's too soon to determine just how big of an impact this will have to Russian railways. Total loading, I'm curious to see August loading results. Railway loading capacity has already been shrinking before Kursk. Remember, there doesn't need to be a silver bullet. Death by 1,000 cuts works too. Eventually, they add up. This counts. Overextending the largest country on earth is a valid offensive strategy. I think that's such an important thread. And then Trentilenko says again, I'm beginning to think we are seeing Russian locomotive operators abandon their engines on the lines approaching Kursk Oblast. Guys get stuck in train traffic jams. They hear directly or from engine ahead. There is artillery fire or sabotage groups. Then they leave. Russian rail seizure. And this refers to that Intel Schizo thread that I went through yesterday. Oh no, it's a different one actually. Further, wasting a short range ballistic missile on an individual tank is a massive waste. Secondly, it shows that there is a huge logistical issue with Russian forces in Kursk, specifically the MTO brigades, that they are meant to supply Russian forces from strategic railheads, such as in this case the cities of Kursk and Belgorod, and are stretched with supply convoys having to travel roughly 150 plus miles from the rail yard to the Russian front lines and back, and 90 miles round trip from rail yard to the Red Stars that are highlighted on a map. So remember, I talked about this, where you've got these staging points, and then they have to get from these rail staging points, often by road, to these stars to supply their forces in the area. Now, I think the idea here is that you wouldn't send a ballistic missile against a tank, but my goodness, you could justify sending a ballistic missile against a Russian locomotive destroying some rail lines as well, even if it's just for a few days to be fixed up. That how many locomotives do they have readily available? How will that completely screw up the logistics? So I presume, I won't go and read the rest of this, but I presume that the Ukrainians are going to be focusing very heavily on taking out Russian rail logistics. Trent Zelenko says, if this is true, the train congestion from these abandonments will be visible from space. Remember, the Kursk fighting for Russia is an ATO, not an SMO. ATO equals anti-terrorism operation. This means the FSB, and not the Russian military, is nominally in charge of the FSB border group, army, Rosgvardia, police, and local militia units. The problem here is that there is no practice chain of command between these formations and Russian railway employees. They are not under the SMO military discipline or punishments, so they can like up ship and go. They're not going to be held accountable by the FSB in the same way. ATOs, so anti-terrorism organizations, means Russian train crew can bug out with few or none of the repercussions of a special military operation. This would change if Putin made this an Ukrainian incursion a full-on defense of the motherland war. However, Putin seems to fear for the stability of his regime if he does that. Whatever is causing it, train crew running, maintenance failure, or administrative chaos, rail movement into and out of Kursk has been seizing up. This has prevented the Russian artillery, it's God of War, from entering the lists en masse after a week of fighting, or entering the areas en masse. So interesting stuff going on there. Okay, just a few more bits and pieces. Italian journalists visited Sudzha and asked residents why they stayed. Locals said that the Russian soldiers had abandoned them, while Ukrainian soldiers were very kind. Their houses are not destroyed. People are not afraid. It's quiet. Only drones can be heard occasionally. Wow. So we've got Russians saying they don't mind being under Ukrainian control. There's no problems here. And as Ukraine enters the towns of Kursk in the region of Russia, the Kursk region of Russia, sorry, they notice the locals have already destroyed portraits of Putin. Yes, indeed, the Kursk People's Republic is being liberated by Ukraine. I don't know how widespread that is, but there's also evidence that Lenin statues, former Soviet iconic pieces, are being leveled, taken down. This is Sudzha in Kursk region again, where a statue of Lenin has been removed. I presume by Ukrainians there, not by the Russians themselves. But anyway, there is potentially a lot of good news still coming from Kursk region. Yes, the Ukrainians are going to be losing more equipment than the Russians, partly because the Russians don't have that equipment in position. The Ukrainians are going to be using a lot of APCs to move troops around. They will be targeted by Russian drones and Lancets. So yes, the Ukrainians are going to be losing more than Russians, but they are going to be taking vast amounts of territory compared to what the Russians are taking in losing far more troops in, say, the Prokrovsk direction. Yes, the Russians are having success here, but it's not nearly the success that the Ukrainians are having up in Kursk, and the Russians are losing more troops there, it seems, than the Ukrainians are losing up in Kursk. So I think it's very positive at the moment. The question still remains what they're going to do with this land. How does it play out? What are their next objectives? Where is this going? And those are still unanswered largely. Anyway, let me know what you think. Take care, guys. Speak soon.